Most people have never heard of the Kybalion, and for those who have, it usually sits somewhere in the mental filing cabinet labeled old, dusty, mysterious books, right next to stuff you pretend to know about at a dinner party. But if you've ever stumbled across it, even by accident, it has a way of pulling you in, not because it's long, it's barely over 100 pages, but because it seems to promise something enormous. It claims to reveal the 7 laws that govern the universe, not 7 helpful tips, not 7 ways to organize your pantry, the actual cosmic blueprints. And it does so with the kind of calm confidence you usually only see in people who really know something, or in people who are exceptionally good at bluffing. The question is, which is it? When it was first published in 1908, the Kybalion came with no author name, just the enigmatic credit, by 3 initiates. That's it. No preface explaining who they were, no photographs, no interviews. Whoever they were, they clearly didn't want the attention, or they wanted the mystery to do the talking. And oh, it did. You see, the Kybalion presents itself not as a new book, but as a representation of ancient Hermetic wisdom. Hermeticism, supposedly founded by Hermes Trismegistus, is this strange, fascinating hybrid of Greek, Egyptian, and mystical thought. Hermes was said to be a combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, a mythic mashup before mashups were cool. This figure was considered the master of wisdom, the scribe of the gods, and the keeper of secrets too powerful for the average mortal to handle responsibly. So when the Kybalion claims to be based on the teachings of Hermes, it's already playing in the big leagues of mystical marketing. The book itself claims that the principles it contains are universal laws, like gravity. They apply whether you believe in them or not. They operate in the background, quietly shaping everything, from the orbit of planets to the thoughts in your head. That's a bold claim. And the way it's written makes you feel like you're being invited into a private room somewhere deep in an ancient temple. The language is formal but oddly intimate, like it knows you've been searching for something, maybe not even consciously, and it's finally going to hand it to you. But here's where it gets interesting. Nobody knows exactly where the Kybalion came from. Not in the sense of who published it. We know it came from a small Chicago publishing house called the Yogi Publication Society. But the content? That's a whole other rabbit hole. Some say it was written by William Walker Atkinson, a prolific New Thought writer, lawyer and editor, who frankly had more pseudonyms than most people have socks. Others believe it was a collaboration between Atkinson and 2 other esoteric thinkers of the time, Paul Foster Case and Michael Whitty. And then there's the faction that insists the book is far older, that Atkinson and his peers were merely the latest messengers of a tradition going back thousands of years. Of course, this is where the Kybalion becomes a bit like an ancient treasure map. Everyone's arguing over whether it's authentic or just an elaborate reproduction. But here's the thing. Whether you believe it's a modern distillation or a direct download from Hermes himself, the principles inside are fascinating. They're a mix of metaphysics, psychology, and philosophy, written in a way that somehow makes you feel like you've known them all along. And then there's the number 7. Humanity has always had a soft spot for 7s. 7 days of the week. 7 visible planets in ancient astronomy. 7 colors in the rainbow. 7 deadly sins. 7 virtues. So when the Kybalion announces 7 Hermetic principles, your brain already wants to treat them like sacred truths, even before you know what they are. But here's the thing about the Kybalion. It doesn't just tell you these laws exist. It dares you to test them. It says that once you understand them, you can use them, not in the sense of life hacks, but in the sense of influencing the very patterns of reality. It's basically saying, here's the instruction manual to the universe, see what you can do with it. Naturally, this kind of claim has attracted 2 types of people, the devoted students and the dedicated skeptics. The students will tell you that the Kybalion has given them the tools to manifest abundance, heal relationships, and achieve inner peace. The skeptics will tell you it's just new thought repackaged with an Egyptian-Greek aesthetic. Both groups tend to be equally passionate, which makes for some lively debates. But whatever your stance, it's hard to deny that the Kybalion has staying power. Over a century after it was published, it's still being read, studied, debated, and reprinted. You can find it for free online. You can buy it in leather-bound collector's editions. You can even get it on a t-shirt if that's your thing. So, what are these 7 laws? And how did a small, mysterious book published in Chicago in 1908 end up becoming a staple in occult, spiritual, and even self-help circles? That's the story we're going to unravel. But as with any good mystery, we're not going to sprint to the ending. We're going to walk slowly, deliberately down the corridors of history, through the tangled web of myth and fact, until we can see where these laws came from, why they were written the way they were, and why they still have people whispering about them today. If you picture the birth of the Kybalion, you might imagine an ancient scribe hunched over a desk by lamplight, in a temple half buried in the sands of Egypt, while jackals howl in the distance. Reality check. It was more likely a cramped print room in Chicago, smelling faintly of ink and strong coffee, in a building with drafty windows that rattled every time the streetcar went by. 1908, Chicago was a city in transition. This was the era of jazz just starting to bubble, skyscrapers poking into the skyline, and a population exploding with immigrants from every corner of the globe. It was also an intellectual melting pot, a place where you could walk a few blocks and hear lectures on socialism, spiritualism, or seances, depending on which door you stepped through. And in the middle of all this was the Yogi Publication Society, a small but ambitious publishing house that specialized in mystical and New Thought literature. They weren't exactly penguin books. Their catalogue included titles like The Science of Psychic Healing, Thought Vibration, and Clairvoyance and Occult Powers. It was here, under their imprint, that the Kybalion appeared for the first time. No author, just 3 initiates. Whoever they were, they weren't about to make this a publicity tour. No lectures, no signings, no interviews. Just a book dropped into the world like a message in a bottle, and readers were left to wonder who had tossed it into the waters. The prime suspect then and now was William Walker Atkinson. Atkinson was, how do we put this politely, a writing machine. By 1908, he'd already published under his own name and at least half a dozen pseudonyms, sometimes releasing multiple books in a single year. His interests ranged from business psychology to Hindu philosophy, and he had a talent for taking dense spiritual ideas and making them digestible for an early 20th century American audience. The theory goes that Atkinson wrote the Kybalion, perhaps with help from other esoteric thinkers like Paul Foster Case, a Rosicrucian and later founder of Builders of the Adytum, and Michael Whitty. But unlike his other works, this one needed mystery. The content was meant to feel ancient, like something handed down through an unbroken chain of masters. So, 3 initiates it was. But here's where it gets tricky. Even if Atkinson was the author, where did he get the material? The principles in the Kybalion are clearly rooted in Hermetic philosophy, but they're presented in a streamlined, almost modernized way. That suggests the authors weren't just copying an ancient text, they were reinterpreting it for a new audience, one fascinated by both mysticism and the new language of psychology. Hermeticism itself has deep roots. The name comes from Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a mythical figure said to be a fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. In the centuries after Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt, Greek and Egyptian cultures mingled in the city of Alexandria, creating a fertile ground for philosophical cross-pollination. Somewhere in that cultural mix, the Hermetic writings were born, texts on cosmology, alchemy, and spiritual transformation, written in Greek but steeped in Egyptian symbolism. The Hermetic corpus covered a lot: how the universe was formed, the relationship between the divine and the material world, and how human beings could ascend to higher states of consciousness. Over time, these writings would influence everyone from early Christian thinkers to Renaissance alchemists. But by the time the Kybalion rolled around, Hermeticism was more underground, a current of thought flowing quietly beneath the surface of Western spirituality. What the Kybalion did was distill this vast, sprawling tradition into 7 core principles. 7 laws that, according to the book, govern all levels of reality: physical, mental, and spiritual. They are: 1. The principle of mentalism. The all is mind. The universe is mental. 2. The principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. 3. The principle of vibration. Nothing rests. Everything moves. Everything vibrates. 4. The principle of polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. 5. The principle of rhythm. Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. 6. The principle of cause and effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. The principle of gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. On paper they sound almost simple. But like a good chess game, simplicity doesn't mean lack of depth. Each law is described as operating on every level of reality. They're not just metaphors. According to the Kybalion, they're as real as gravity and just as indifferent to whether you approve of them or not. By framing them this way, the 3 initiates made Hermetic thought feel both timeless and practical, You didn't have to be an alchemist in a medieval laboratory or a monk in a desert cave to use these principles. You could apply them to business, relationships, self-mastery, basically life as a whole. And here's where the Chicago of 1908 comes back in. This was a city and a nation that believed in self-improvement. The same people buying the Kybalion were also reading books on how to win friends, influence people, and build fortunes. The idea that there were universal laws you could align with, not just in your spiritual life but in your everyday hustle, was magnetic. So when the Kybalion hit the shelves, it didn't just appeal to mystics. It found its way into the hands of businessmen, artists, and seekers of every stripe. And because it carried no author's name, the mystique only deepened. Was this the work of a hidden master, a secret society, or just a clever publishing strategy? No one knew. And maybe that was the point. The thing about the Kybalion is that it doesn't try to win you over with personality. There are no anecdotes about the author's lives, no dear reader moments, no charming stories about discovering these truths in a candlelit monastery. The book reads like it's coming from someone who doesn't need you to know who they are. That's either very humble or very calculated. The three initiates' identity was a clever device. In esoteric traditions, an initiate is someone who has been accepted into an inner circle of knowledge. The word itself implies there are others who are not initiated, outsiders. By naming themselves three initiates, the authors were essentially saying, "We've been let in, we've seen behind the curtain, and now we're going to pass on just enough of that knowledge to you." But here's the catch. The book is not overly ceremonial. There's no long-winded description of secret rites, no instructions on joining a mysterious order. This isn't Freemasonry with its degrees and handshakes. The Kybalion presents its laws as if they're simply the rules of reality, existing whether you're part of a club or not. The initiates in this sense are less like priests and more like translators. And that's important, because the early 1900s were full of competing voices claiming to have the real ancient wisdom. You had theosophists, Rosicrucians, spiritualists, Christian Science, New Thought. It was a buffet of metaphysical ideas. People were hungry for meaning, but they were also suspicious of cult-like control. The Kybalion threaded the needle perfectly, mysterious enough to feel special, but universal enough to avoid dogma. Still, the question lingers. If William Walker Atkinson was indeed the primary author, who were the other two initiates? Or were there even two others at all? Some believe Paul Foster Case could have been one of them. Case was a gifted occultist and musician, deeply involved in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secretive British society that counted poets, magicians, and intellectuals among its ranks. He was known for his ability to explain mystical concepts in a way that felt both scholarly and approachable. If you've read his later writings, you'll find echoes of the Kybalion style, precise yet poetic. Others point to Michael Whitty, an editor at the Yogi Publication Society, as a possible contributor. Whitty's role in editing and refining Atkinson's works is well documented, and some say he had a talent for condensing sprawling philosophical ideas into neat, digestible packages. If Atkinson brought the raw material and Case supplied the deeper occult framework, Whitty could have been the one to polish it into the final, tightly woven text. Of course, there's a third possibility, that the three initiates was entirely fictional, a smokescreen. Atkinson could have written the whole thing himself, and invented the other two as a way of lending the work a sense of collective authority, as if it came from a council of wisdom rather than one man with a typewriter and a deadline. What's undeniable is that the Kybalion feels curated. It's not an unfiltered download of Hermetic thought. The original Hermetic texts, like the Corpus Hermeticum, are dense, sometimes contradictory, and steeped in ancient cosmology. The Kybalion trims all that down into 7 bite-sized laws that can fit in your pocket, and theoretically in your life. Take the principle of mentalism, for example. In classical Hermeticism, the concept of the all is a layered one, part God, part mind, part ineffable mystery. The Kybalion authors simplify it. The all is mind, the universe is mental. It's elegant, it's memorable. It's also vague enough to allow a wide range of interpretations, which might be why it survived more than a century without becoming outdated. The principle of correspondence, as above, so below, is another good example. This phrase existed long before the Kybalion, appearing in the Hermetic Emerald Tablet, which, if you've ever dabbled in alchemy, you know is basically the genre's greatest hit. The authors keep the essence but strip away the alchemical specifics, turning it into a flexible metaphor for interconnectedness. And that's the genius of the book. It gives you the scaffolding, without dictating what the building should look like. It's a set of master keys, not a floor plan. You can use them to unlock doors in your personal life, your relationships, your business, or your spiritual practice, and no one's going to come along and tell you you're doing it wrong. Which brings us back to the question of teachers. One of the more romantic theories is that the three initiates were real in the sense that they represented three archetypal roles. The scholar, who brought the historical and philosophical foundation, the mystic, who infused it with spiritual resonance, and the pragmatist, who shaped it into a tool for everyday life. Whether these roles were embodied by three separate people, or by one person wearing three hats, the result was the same, a text that could appeal across the spectrum. It's tempting to imagine these initiates meeting in a dimly lit back room, perhaps in the offices of the Yogi Publication Society, with stacks of manuscripts and half-drunk cups of coffee. They'd argue over wording, strike through unnecessary flourishes, and test each phrase for memorability. At some point, one of them might have leaned back and said, "You know, if we do this right, they'll still be talking about this book in 100 years. And here we are. The identity of the three initiates may never be definitively solved, but maybe that's the point. Mysteries have a way of outlasting answers. Anonymity gave the Kybalion a kind of eternal voice, one that speaks without being tied to any single life or personality. And in a way, that's very hermetic. If the Kybalion were a movie, the opening chapters would be the slow pan across a shadowy table. On it, 7 strange keys are laid out. They're not labeled in the language you'd expect. No love, health, or money, just abstract names. Mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, gender. It's almost like the authors wanted to make sure you'd lean forward and ask, what on earth does gender mean in a spiritual book from 1908? And that's the point. The words are familiar enough to not feel alien, but strange enough to feel like you're overhearing something not meant for everyone. The first key, mentalism, is the backbone. The all is mind. The universe is mental. That's the line. Short enough to put on a t-shirt, deep enough to launch decades of philosophical debates. In essence, it says that everything you see, touch, and experience originates from mind, not the human brain exactly, but a universal consciousness. This wasn't a totally new idea in 1908. Plato hinted at it. Eastern philosophies had been saying it for centuries, but the Kybalion packaged it like a simple axiom rather than a tangled treatise. Here's where it gets clever. The authors don't waste pages trying to convince you. They just assert it, as if it's already obvious. That subtle confidence pulls you in. You might not fully buy it yet, but you're curious to see where it goes. Then comes correspondence, the famous as above so below, as below so above. This is the principle that makes conspiracy theorists, spiritual seekers, and armchair philosophers all nod in agreement for totally different reasons. It suggests that patterns repeat at every scale. The motion of galaxies mirrors the structure of atoms. The rise and fall of civilizations echoes the seasons. Your personal struggles reflect universal struggles. It's like the cosmos is playing a never-ending game of Russian nesting dolls. The third key is vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. In 1908, this would have sounded almost mystical. Today, with quantum physics confirming that matter is just energy dancing at different frequencies, it sounds almost prophetic. But the Kybalion doesn't get bogged down in science. It treats vibration as both a physical and a spiritual truth. Your mood, your thoughts, your energy are all vibrations, and they can be shifted. By the time you reach polarity, you realize this isn't just a list, it's a worldview. Polarity says everything is dual, light and dark, hot and cold, love and hate. But the trick is, opposites are actually the same thing, just at different degrees. Hot and cold are both temperature, love and hate are both intense emotions. The line between them is thinner than we think, which explains a lot about human behavior and soap operas. Rhythm is the fifth key. Everything flows, out and in, everything has its tides. This one feels like it was written while staring at the ocean. It's about cycles, day and night, life and death, expansion and contraction. If polarity explains the what, rhythm explains the when. The book suggests that if you can anticipate the swing of the pendulum, you can ride it instead of getting smacked in the face when it swings back. The sixth is cause and effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. This one doesn't even pretend to be mystical. It's the law that scientists and magicians both agree on. Nothing happens by accident. The Kybalion goes further, though, by suggesting that most people live on the effect side of life, reacting to things. The initiates encourage you to move to the cause side, to act deliberately, to initiate change instead of waiting for it. Finally, there's gender. And no, It's not talking about male and female as a social construct. Here, gender refers to a universal principle of creation. Everything contains both masculine and feminine qualities. It's yin and yang, logic and intuition, action and receptivity. The book insists this principle operates on all planes, physical, mental and spiritual, and that balance between these aspects is essential for creation. What makes these 7 laws so sticky in the mind is that they're framed not as beliefs, but as mechanics. They're presented as if they're as unavoidable as gravity. You don't have to like them. You don't even have to understand them. They're happening with or without your consent. And that framing is powerful. In the spiritual marketplace of the early 20th century, a lot of teachers were peddling personal charisma. Follow me, I'll show you the way. The Kybalion flipped that. It wasn't about the teacher. It was about the keys on the table. Anyone could pick them up. This also meant the book could travel further than most teachings. You didn't have to join a movement or buy into a cosmology. You could be a Christian, a Hindu, a skeptic, or a full-blown occultist, and still find these laws useful. They could sit quietly in the background of your life, influencing your thinking without demanding you convert to anything. Of course, that universality is part of why critics have called the Kybalion more of a philosophical self-help book than a true Hermetic text. The original Hermetic writings are steeped in metaphysics, gods, and mystical visions. The Kybalion strips away most of that and leaves you with a toolkit, 7 principles you can apply without needing incense or a robe. But maybe that's why it's lasted. A pure historical artifact might have stayed locked in libraries. A pure self-help book might have faded with changing trends. By blending the two, dressing practical advice in ancient robes, the authors created something timeless. In the next part, we'll start unpacking these laws one by one, not just as abstract ideas, but in the way the Kybalion frames them, as levers you can pull in the machinery of your own reality. If the Kybalion were a courtroom drama, mentalism would be Exhibit A. The first piece of evidence the authors slide across the table with that we rest our case look. It begins with a sentence so bold it's almost smug. The all is mind, the universe is mental. No footnotes, no apology for the audacity of the claim. Just here it is, deal with it. At first glance you could mistake it for poetic fluff, but in the world of Hermetic philosophy, this is the nuclear core. Everything else, the other 6 principles, the secret handshakes, the mysterious diagrams, rests on this one idea: reality itself is a thought. Now, to be clear, this isn't your reality is what you believe in the Instagram inspirational quote sense. The Kybalion doesn't mean that if you think about a Ferrari hard enough, one will magically appear in your driveway. If it did, the authors would have been driving Ferraris long before Ferrari existed. Instead, it's pointing to something deeper, that the substrate of everything is consciousness. If that sounds like something out of Eastern philosophy, that's because it is, sort of. The idea has cousins in Hindu Vedanta, in Buddhist thought, in Taoism. The difference is that the Hermetic tradition doesn't couch it in the language of detachment or enlightenment. It couches it in the language of mechanics. If the universe is mental, then the laws that govern thought are the same laws that govern everything else. This is where the metaphor of the all comes in. The Kybalion describes the all as infinite, unknowable, unchangeable, but still conscious. It's not a bearded man in the sky, nor is it a cold, indifferent void. It's more like an infinite mind dreaming, and we're inside the dream. In the 1908 context, this was quietly revolutionary. Remember, this was the era when materialism was riding high. Science was mapping atoms, inventing radio, putting electricity in homes. The prevailing worldview was that matter came first, and consciousness was just a byproduct of brain chemistry. The Kybalion flips that on its head. In Hermetic thought, matter is the byproduct. The brain is not the generator of consciousness, it's the receiver. Like a radio picking up a signal, your mind tunes into the infinite broadcast of the all. Now, if you think that's a stretch, consider this. Even today, physics still can't explain consciousness. We can scan brains, track electrical impulses, map neural networks, but no one can point to the exact place where you exist. The Hermetists would smirk at that and say, "Of course you can't. You're trying to find the ocean inside a single wave." Here's where the principle of mentalism starts to get practical. If everything is mind, then every change begins at the mental level. Physical events are just downstream effects. It's like working on the source code of a program instead of clicking around in the user interface hoping for a miracle. The Kybalion suggests that the initiated, those who understand this principle, can deliberately shape their own reality by shaping their mental states. That doesn't mean ignoring the physical world, but rather recognizing that physical events are secondary. The catch? Your mind isn't the only mind in the game. The all contains everyone's thoughts, and reality is the combined projection. So while you can influence, you're also swimming in the collective currents of humanity's beliefs, fears, and desires. Think of it like weather. You can't stop a storm by thinking sunny thoughts, but you can build a better umbrella, or move to higher ground, or even influence the microclimate around you. The initiated use mental mastery not to control the whole universe, but to navigate it without being tossed around by every gust of wind. The authors of the Kybalion are careful to frame this as a responsibility. Mentalism isn't about bending reality for selfish gain, not because it's wrong, but because it's short-sighted. Every thought has ripples. The Hermetic student learns to hold thoughts that harmonize with the greater order, not just personal whims. And here's the curveball. The Kybalion admits you'll never truly know the all. The infinite mind can't be fully grasped by a finite one. The best you can do is understand its principles and work within them. It's like learning the rules of chess without ever meeting the grandmaster. In practical terms, the principle of mentalism is less about manifesting stuff, and more about cultivating mental discipline. It's about catching yourself when you're thinking in ways that drag you down, and deliberately shifting to states that open possibilities, not because the universe will reward you with a cookie, but because your experience of reality is inseparable from the quality of your thoughts. The power here is subtle but massive. Change the filter and the whole picture changes. The untrained mind reacts to reality as if it's fixed. The trained mind shapes its own lens, and in doing so, changes the game. And this is just the first key. One sentence. The all is mind. And already the room feels different. You start wondering, if everything begins in mind, then what about patterns? What about the way small things mirror big things? That, as the Kybalion promises, is where the second key, correspondence, comes in, and it's about to take us from the infinite mind to the cosmic echo chamber. If the principle of mentalism was Hermetic Law 101, correspondence is the upgrade pack. This is the one most people have heard of, even if they've never cracked open the Kybalion or studied anything more esoteric than a horoscope. It's where we get that sticky, endlessly quotable phrase, as above, so below, as below, so above. It sounds poetic enough to be printed on an overpriced yoga mat, but the origins are much older, carved into the intellectual stonework of Hermetic philosophy and traced back, at least in legend, to the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. Now the idea is deceptively simple. Patterns repeat themselves at every level of reality. What happens in the macrocosm, the big cosmic stage, is reflected in the microcosm, the small personal stage. The galaxies swirl in spirals, so do seashells. The circulation of planets mirrors the circulation of electrons. Empires rise and fall like the human heartbeat, expansion, contraction, rest. To the Hermetic mind, this isn't coincidence, it's law. The same blueprint is at work in everything. And if you can understand that blueprint in one domain, you can apply it to another. That's the practical gold here. Ancient Hermetists weren't just staring at stars for fun, they were looking for clues. If the movement of the heavens could tell them about the seasons, maybe it could also tell them about human moods, or the rise and fall of civilizations, not because the planets control us, but because we're all playing to the same sheet music. You can see why this principle had staying power. It gives you a kind of decoder ring for reality. Study one layer deeply enough, and you can make educated guesses about the rest. The ancient alchemist might watch the way water changes into steam and wonder, could the same transformation happen in the human spirit? The political strategist might look at the cycles of nature and predict when a kingdom is headed for winter. It's also why Hermeticism blends so easily with other mystical traditions. Correspondence plays nice with astrology, numerology, tarot, Kabbalah, anything where patterns cross-pollinate. To a Hermeticist, those aren't separate belief systems, they're just different dialects of the same universal language. Now, in 1908, when the Kybalion came out, this idea got a bit of a modern polish. The authors framed correspondence as a mental tool for problem solving. Can't figure out how to approach a problem in one area of your life? Look at how a similar problem plays out somewhere else, maybe even in nature. They were essentially advocating analogical thinking, long before self-help books made it trendy. There's a practical genius to that. Let's say you're struggling to manage a difficult team at work. If you understand correspondence, you might compare it to managing a garden. You don't yell at a plant for growing slowly, You check its environment, sunlight, water, soil. That analogy doesn't just make you feel wise, it can actually guide your actions. But, and this is where the Kybalion leans in with a cautionary wag of the finger, correspondence is not a license to oversimplify. Just because two things look alike doesn't mean they're identical. The point is not to play find the matching pattern like a kid's puzzle, but to train your mind to see the underlying harmony. In the Hermetic worldview, this harmony is the fingerprint of the all. It's evidence that we're not living in a random, chaotic mess, but in a coherent system where everything connects. To the uninitiated, that can feel like magical thinking. To the initiated, it's just thinking. And here's where the humor creeps in, because humans are really bad at seeing the patterns that actually matter. We'll happily connect I wore my lucky socks with my team one, but miss the more relevant correspondence between I never sleep and I keep making bad decisions. The Kybalion basically says, learn to spot the right correspondences, and your life gets a whole lot easier. From a historical angle, this principle also explains why Hermetic philosophy has such a broad appeal. In an age when knowledge was fragmented, astronomers over here, herbalists over there, theologians in their own tower, correspondence was the bridge. It gave everyone permission to talk to each other. The herbalist could see their plant medicine as part of the same pattern the astronomer saw in planetary motion. Suddenly, the world felt unified, and unity was the point. The principle of correspondence isn't just about clever metaphors, it's about dissolving the artificial walls between disciplines, people, and worlds. So how does the Kybalion suggest we use it? Not by memorizing lists of patterns, but by becoming pattern sensitive, by looking for echoes, by paying attention when the shape of one thing shows up somewhere totally different. The book doesn't hand you a universal key, it teaches you how to make your own, by noticing how the tumblers align. And once you get it, you start seeing it everywhere. In history, in relationships, in nature. The political instability of a country might resemble the family dynamics of a dinner table. The way you approach your health might correspond eerily to the way you manage your finances. To the Hermeticist, these aren't coincidences, they're signals. And if you can learn to read them, you can anticipate shifts, prepare for change, and ride the cycles instead of being crushed by them. It's easy to see why this principle was taught after mentalism. If the universe is mind, correspondence is the mind's habit of making itself known in repeating forms. It's like the all is constantly leaving breadcrumbs, daring you to notice that the forest floor and the night sky are 2 pages from the same book. And that breadcrumb trail leads us straight to the third principle, vibration. If correspondence is about the shape of things, vibration is about their motion, and according to the Kybalion, nothing in this mental universe is truly still. If correspondence told you everything is connected, vibration tells you everything is moving, even the things that swear they're standing still. To a Hermeticist, motion isn't optional. Stillness is a kind of illusion, the way a statue looks frozen, but if you could zoom into the atoms, you'd see a rave party happening on a subatomic level. The Kybalion phrases it bluntly. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. This is where ancient philosophy and modern science shake hands across the centuries. Hermetic teachers in Egypt, Greece, and Alexandria didn't have electron microscopes, but they knew through observation, experimentation, and a kind of disciplined intuition that life was never static. They saw the wind shaping stone, heat turning water into steam, moods shifting a crowd. They understood that movement wasn't just a property of matter, it was a property of being. Now, let's rewind to the old Hermetic schools. Imagine a dusty courtyard. Students seated cross-legged as a teacher points at a copper bowl of water. He stirs it gently, then lets it settle. The surface looks calm, but he drops in a single pebble, and ripples expand outward. This, he says, is the illusion of rest. Beneath every calm surface is motion, and they didn't mean this poetically. They believed vibration was the mechanism by which the all, that infinite mental reality introduced in Principle 1, differentiated itself into things. Change the vibration, you change the thing. Shift the frequency, you shift the experience. This is why the Kybalion spends so much time on mental states here. To the Hermetic mind, thoughts aren't invisible clouds floating in your head. They're vibrations. Emotions? Vibrations. Desires? Vibrations. The goal wasn't to stop them, remember. Nothing stops but to learn to raise, lower, and refine them. Here's where the ancient teachers could get a little mischievous. They'd say, you think you're in a bad mood because of what happened to you today. No. You're in a bad mood because your vibration dropped. And then the world started reflecting that back to you. That's the Hermetic twist. The vibration comes first, the event comes second. And this wasn't just armchair philosophy. They had exercises, chanting, rhythmic breathing, focused visualization, designed to deliberately shift vibration. These weren't random rituals, they were early experiments in what today we might call sound therapy, biofield tuning, or even cognitive reframing. The more ambitious practitioners pushed it further, claiming they could alter the vibration of physical matter, turning solid into liquid, bitter into sweet, heavy into light. Now, were they doing actual transmutation, or were they just the David Copperfields of the ancient world? History's silent on that. But the belief that vibration could alter reality kept Hermetic philosophy feeling less like dusty theory and more like a usable tool. And here's the fun part. They saw this everywhere. In music, the strings of a lyre vibrating at just the right pitch could calm a warrior or fire him up for battle. In medicine, the right rhythm of touch or chant could retune the body. Even in politics, a speech could shift the vibration of an entire city, raising it toward unity or lowering it toward chaos. Fast forward to 1908, and the Kybalion's authors had to walk a line. Science was advancing, and people were starting to hear about atoms and energy, so they couched the principle in language that would make sense to both mystics and the scientifically curious. They compared the differences between solids, liquids, and gases to differences in vibration. They even hinted that the differences between mental states could be thought of the same way, low-frequency anger versus high-frequency inspiration. It was a brilliant move. It gave readers a bridge between ancient teachings and modern physics, without forcing them to pick a side. And it preserved the key Hermetic insight. If you can master vibration, you can master change. That's the hidden promise of this principle. You can't make something stop moving, but you can direct its motion. You can't halt change, but you can influence the rate and quality of it. It's like surfing. You can't stop the ocean, but you can learn to ride the wave. And because Hermetic teachers couldn't resist a little hierarchy, they insisted that the one who could control vibration could influence others who couldn't. Not in a sinister mind control way, well, usually, but in the sense that a calm, steady vibration tends to entrain a chaotic one. This is why certain people walk into a room and everyone relaxes or tenses up. Vibration is contagious. So how do you apply it? In the Kybalion, the advice is surprisingly hands-on. Observe your own vibration, mental, emotional, even physical. Identify what raises it and what lowers it. Practice shifting it on purpose through breath, thought, movement, sound. Use it to influence conditions rather than be influenced by them. Simple? Yes. Easy? No. But Hermeticism was never about easy. This principle also sets the stage for what's coming next, polarity. Because once you understand that everything is vibrating, you realize that opposites aren't really different things at all. They're just the same thing vibrating at different rates. And that's where Hermetic philosophy goes from interesting to head-spinning. Because if you accept that, then you have to accept that love and hate, light and dark, hot and cold, they're not separate forces. They're points on the same scale, and vibration is the slider. So with correspondence, you learned that patterns repeat. With vibration, you learned that those patterns are never still. And next, with polarity, you'll learn that every opposite you've ever believed in might just be a matter of degree. If the principle of vibration was Hermeticism's way of telling you everything is moving, the principle of polarity is its way of adding, and by the way, the things you think are opposites. Yeah, they're basically the same thing wearing different outfits. The Kybalion states it like this. Everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites, like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature but different in degree. This is where ancient philosophy stops holding your hand and starts blowing your mind. Imagine sitting in a lecture hall in Alexandria, thinking you're finally getting the hang of Hermetic thought, when the teacher suddenly tells you that hot and cold are not different, they're just temperature, vibrating at different rates. At first you might roll your eyes because yes, technically that's true in physics. But then they take it further. Love and hate? Same thing. Courage and fear? Same thing. Life and death? Same thing. The only difference is the position on the spectrum, and your perspective. This wasn't just a clever thought experiment. It was a practical key to transformation. In Hermetic thinking, if two things are the same in nature but different in degree, then in theory, you can shift one into the other. You can raise cold to become warm, fear to become confidence, ignorance to become knowledge. Polarity wasn't about denying differences, it was about learning to navigate them. Historically, this principle pops up all over the place. Egyptian temple inscriptions describe the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, as reflections of a single divine order. Greek philosophy had Heraclitus saying, "The road up and the road down are the same road." Even the yin and yang symbol in Taoism is basically polarity's distant cousin. One thing, two aspects, endlessly cycling. The Hermetic schools turned this into mental training. Let's say you had a student who was prone to anger. Instead of telling him, "Stop being angry," the teacher would say, "Shift your vibration toward calm. They are not enemies. They are ends of the same stick. Move your hand along the stick." The idea was that you couldn't eliminate an emotional state by fighting it. You had to transform it. And here's where the humor comes in. Ancient Hermetic texts love to point out that people spend their lives arguing about which pole is better, without realizing they're arguing about the same thing. It's like two people fighting over whether a glass is half full or half empty, all while someone else quietly drinks it. By the time the Kybalion was published in 1908, the authors leaned into relatable examples. They compared light and darkness, explaining that darkness is not a real thing, it's simply the absence of light. Similarly, cold is the absence of heat. By framing it this way, they made polarity less mystical and more like an operating manual for life. They also applied it to morality, which is where things got spicy. Good and evil, they argued, are not absolute categories but degrees of the same quality. That doesn't mean you should live without ethics. It means that understanding polarity gives you the ability to move away from one pole toward the other with intention. In a way, polarity was Hermeticism's built-in antidote to extremism. The wise Hermeticist avoided getting stuck at either end of the spectrum, knowing that life has a habit of swinging you to the opposite pole if you grip too tightly to one. That's why ancient Egyptian myths often paired gods with their opposite, order with chaos, creation with destruction, not to pit them in eternal war but to remind you they were part of a whole. One of the more entertaining examples from history comes from Pythagoras, who may have borrowed Hermetic ideas. He taught that health is the balance of opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry, active and passive. Tip too far in any direction and you invite sickness. It's the same in politics, relationships, even personal habits. Imbalance at one pole eventually invites a correction from the other. The Kybalion didn't shy away from the mystical implications either. They hinted that birth and death, which we treat as ultimate opposites, are simply transitions along the scale of existence. To a Hermeticist, dying is like changing channels. You're still part of the same broadcast. And this is where polarity becomes more than a clever metaphor. It becomes a tool for power. If you understand that opposites are the same in nature, you can reframe situations in ways others can't. A rival sees only loss and gain. You see both as movement along a continuum. A friend sees failure and success as opposites. You see them as phases in the same cycle. That shift in perception gives you resilience, patience, and let's be honest, a slight smugness in debates. But perhaps the most hermetic application is self-mastery. Instead of being yanked back and forth between extremes by circumstance, you learn to slide yourself deliberately along the scale. And because polarity connects to the principle of vibration, you do it by changing your state, adjusting your frequency to move toward the pole you want. Of course, this takes discipline. Ancient teachers warned that without awareness, polarity can work against you. A burst of joy can swing into despair, a surge of courage into recklessness. Mastery comes from knowing where you are on the scale at any moment and making small intentional shifts rather than dramatic, exhausting swings. By the time a Hermetic student had internalized polarity, they'd start seeing it everywhere. In the seasons, in the rise and fall of civilizations, in the daily moods of the marketplace. The teacher's final word would usually be, "If you think you've found an opposite, look closer. You're probably holding both ends of the same rope." And with that, the class would move on to the next principle, rhythm, which, as you might guess, explains exactly why those swings between poles happen in the first place. If polarity was the Hermetic law that explained why opposites exist, rhythm is the one that explains why life keeps shoving you from one to the other, whether you like it or not. The Kybalion states it plainly. Everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall, the pendulum swing manifests in everything, the measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left, rhythm compensates. In other words, the universe moves like a pendulum, and you're not standing outside of it. You are the pendulum. And if you've ever had a week where you felt unstoppable on Monday and wanted to vanish into a blanket fort by Thursday, Congratulations, you've already experienced it. Ancient Hermeticists saw rhythm everywhere. In the Nile's flooding and receding, in the changing of seasons, in the rise and collapse of dynasties, even in human emotions, love surging in and out like tides, confidence swelling and shrinking. It wasn't just poetic observation, it was a warning. Ignore rhythm, and you'll spend your life being tossed between extremes without understanding why. The Egyptians built much of their agricultural life around this principle. The Nile's flood was both a disaster and a blessing, depending on whether you'd prepared for it. Temples had carvings showing the river goddess in two forms, the nurturing bringer of fertility and the destructive flood, as a reminder that rhythm isn't inherently good or bad, it just is. The Greeks caught on to this too. Heraclitus famously said, "The sun is new each day," but he also taught that war and peace, abundance and famine were part of a larger pulse in nature. Later in Rome, historians like Polybius wrote about the anacyclosis, the cyclical rise and fall of governments. Democracies would turn into oligarchies, oligarchies into tyrannies, tyrannies back into democracies. Different actors, same stage, same swing. The Kybalion takes this natural law and hands you a personal survival strategy. If you can't stop the pendulum from swinging, you can neutralize its effect on you. This wasn't about denying life's highs and lows. It was about keeping your center while they happened. Hermetic students were taught something called the art of neutralization. The idea was simple but brutally hard in practice. Instead of clinging to the highs and panicking at the lows, you rise above the swing mentally. You watch the motion without getting dragged with it. A master might still experience winter and summer, joy and sorrow, but internally they'd stay steady. And here's the tricky part. Rhythm works in both directions. The higher your swing in one direction, the stronger the inevitable return. Extreme success often invites extreme backlash. Intense love can fuel intense heartbreak. Ancient teachers would smirk and say, "The pendulum always collects its debt." Of course, once you know this, you start spotting it in the modern world without even trying. Stock markets. Pure rhythm. They go up, they go down, and everyone acts surprised. Pop culture. One decade's fashion disaster becomes the next decade's trend. Social moods. One year we're obsessed with hyper-productivity. The next year everyone's preaching slow living. Humorously, the Kybalion's authors in 1908 even pointed out how rhythm plays out in your social life. The friend who's obsessed with a hobby for 3 months and then swears it's boring? Rhythm. The family member who's either on a health kick or living exclusively on donuts? Rhythm. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But here's where the Hermetic mindset turns observation into power. If you know rhythm will pull you down after a high, you can prepare for it. You can store resources, rest your body, strengthen your mind. The ancient Egyptians stockpiled grain after a good harvest because they knew the Nile wouldn't be as generous every year. You can do the same in your own life. Not with grain, maybe, but with energy, money, relationships. It's not about becoming robotic. The Kybalion never said don't enjoy the highs. It said don't become their prisoner. The master can enjoy the swing up without dreading the swing down, because they know it's part of the game. And when the pendulum swings low, they don't panic. They know it's already on its way back up. One of the best historical examples of someone applying rhythm is Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher. He ruled during wars, plagues, and political chaos. Yet in his private writings he constantly reminded himself, the universe is change, life is opinion. He was essentially practicing Hermetic rhythm, reminding himself that no extreme lasts forever. The other application is timing. If you know the pendulum is moving toward a favorable point, you act. Ancient traders timed their voyages with monsoon winds. Farmers planted with moon phases. Even military generals planned campaigns during the enemy's low swing. Rhythm isn't just predictable, it's exploitable. There's also a deep psychological benefit here. A Hermetic teacher might tell a student in despair, "This too shall pass," not as a platitude, but as a literal observation of natural law. And to the student riding a wave of good fortune, they might quietly add, "This too shall pass," as a reminder to stay humble. In the end, the principle of rhythm isn't asking you to flatten your life into a dull line. It's asking you to dance with the pendulum without letting it drag you off the floor. And once you've learned to do that, you're ready for the next Hermetic key, the principle of cause and effect, which shifts the question from "why is this happening to me?" to "what chain of causes did I set in motion to get here?" If rhythm explains why life moves in cycles, cause and effect explains why nothing, absolutely nothing happens out of the blue. The Kybalion lays it out bluntly. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. To the Hermetic mind, luck is a lazy explanation. Accident is what people call it when they can't see the chain of events that led there. And fate? That's just cause and effect playing out from a level you don't have the instruments to measure. Ancient Egypt understood this law through Ma'at, the goddess and principle of truth, justice and cosmic order. Ma'at wasn't just about morality, she was about the underlying structure of reality. If the Nile flooded too much or too little, they believed it was tied to human actions, dishonesty in the market, corruption in leadership, even disrespect to the gods. They weren't being superstitious so much as translating an invisible chain of causes into the language they knew. The Greeks took it in another direction with Aristotle's concept of the four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. He argued that for anything to exist, you had to look at what it was made of, what shape it took, what set it in motion, and what purpose it served. Drop a clay pot, it breaks. The material cause, clay. The efficient cause, you knocking it over. The final cause, maybe holding water, which it now can't do. The Kybalion's authors, writing in the early 1900s, gave it a modern twist. They suggested that most people live as effects, being pushed around by circumstances, moods, and other people's decisions. The few who rise to mastery learn to become causes, deliberately setting things in motion rather than waiting for life to happen to them. This wasn't just motivational talk. It was a survival skill in ancient times. A farmer who understood cause and effect didn't blame the gods when his crops failed. He studied the soil, the season, and his planting method. A general who understood it didn't call a loss bad luck. He examined the troop formations, the timing, the terrain. In the Hermetic world, if you're blaming fortune, you've already lost. One fascinating historical application is found in the Library of Alexandria. Scholars there, centuries before the Kybalion, were obsessed with finding the hidden causes behind everything. They collected scrolls from Egypt, Greece, India, and Babylon, cross-referencing astronomy with crop yields, political uprisings with solar eclipses. They weren't conspiracy theorists. They were looking for patterns, and they understood that if you could predict a pattern, you could influence it. The Kybalion also points out that cause and effect operates on multiple planes: physical, mental, and spiritual. You might throw a rock, physical cause, and break a window, physical effect. But the decision to throw it started in the mental plane. An idea, an impulse, maybe even anger planted in your mind earlier, mental cause. And some Hermeticists would argue there's a spiritual plane too, where deeper, unseen laws govern why certain events cluster together in your life. The real Hermetic trick: recognizing when you're the cause, and when you're the effect of someone else's cause. In politics, in business, in relationships, if you don't know which side of that equation you're on, you're likely the pawn, not the player. Consider Julius Caesar. His rise wasn't just charisma or military genius. It was a chain of deliberate causes, strategic alliances, calculated risks, relentless propaganda. And when he crossed the Rubicon, sparking civil war, it wasn't fate, it was the inevitable effect of years of moves that had cornered both him and the Roman Senate. Cause and effect also strips away the comfort of randomness. If you trip walking down the street, yes, gravity played a role, but so did your shoelace being untied, your choice of shoes, the uneven pavement, and your decision to look at your phone instead of where you were going. Hermetic students were trained to look backward from any event, tracing the chain until they understood how it could have been altered. That last bit is where the power comes in. If you know how something happened, you can reproduce it or prevent it. Ancient sailors, once they understood the cause of seasonal winds, didn't pray for them, they set their sails accordingly. Traders, once they knew which moon phases triggered buying frenzies at markets, stocked goods in advance. The Kybalion warns against one common trap: thinking you can break the law. You can't. You can only work with it or be worked by it. Trying to cheat cause and effect is like trying to skip the planting season and still expecting a harvest. The master doesn't resist the law, they ride it. On a more personal note, the law can be uncomfortable because it forces responsibility. It means the quality of your relationships, your finances, even your peace of mind are tied to chains of cause you've either set in motion or allowed to happen. That can sting, but once you accept it, you stop waiting for miracles and start engineering them. And perhaps the most hermetic of all ideas here, you can be a cause in one plane and an effect in another at the same time. You might be the cause of a project's success at work, mental and physical plane, but the effect of your mentor's guidance years ago, spiritual plane. The chains weave together, and mastery lies in seeing as many of them as possible. Once you get that, you stop calling things coincidences and start asking better questions. And asking better questions sets the next law into motion. The principle of gender, which reveals why every act of creation, from the birth of a star to the start of an idea, is the union of two forces working together. The Kybalion ends its list of the 7 Hermetic principles with one that often gets misunderstood, especially in the modern age, the principle of gender. And no, this isn't about biological sex in the political or cultural sense. This is about creation itself, the blueprint of how anything physical, mental, or spiritual comes into being. The Kybalion states, "Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes. To the Hermetic mind, masculine and feminine aren't about men and women, but about complementary forces. The masculine is the active, projecting, initiating principle. The feminine is the receptive, nurturing, formative principle. Think of them like electricity and magnetism, different but inseparable in producing power." Ancient cultures recognized this in their own ways. In Egypt, the god Osiris, masculine, and goddess Isis, feminine, weren't just a divine couple, they were symbols of the dual forces that sustain the universe. In China, Taoist philosophy expresses it as yang, masculine, active, bright, and yin, feminine, receptive, dark. Neither is superior, both are necessary. The Greeks gave us Zeus and Hera, but they also embedded the principle in their philosophy. Plato described creation as the union of being, masculine, and becoming, feminine, the eternal form meeting the fertile space where it could take shape. Here's where the Kybalion differs from casual mythology. It insists that gender operates on all planes. On the physical plane, it's obvious, male and female roles in reproduction. But on the mental plane, the masculine is your ability to project thoughts, ideas, and plans. The feminine is your capacity to receive inspiration, nurture concepts, and give them form. You can't invent anything without both. A brilliant idea masculine that's never developed remains a ghost. Endless brainstorming, without the decisive act, stays a daydream. The masters in Hermetic tradition learned to balance both, to generate the spark and then patiently cultivate it. Historically, misunderstanding or rejecting this principle led to some interesting failures. Take medieval alchemy. Many alchemists obsessed over the sun, symbolizing the masculine principle, heat, force, transformation, but neglected the moon, the feminine principle, cooling, nurturing, shaping. The result? They couldn't complete the great work because they were only playing with half the equation. Or look at leadership. A ruler who embodies only the masculine force, pushing, commanding, initiating, burns out their people. One who embodies only the feminine force, nurturing, yielding, waiting, risks stagnation. The most successful leaders in history, from Cleopatra to Marcus Aurelius, learned to wield both, decisive when action was needed, receptive when wisdom required listening. The Kybalion also warns against confusing the planes. Just because someone has a masculine physical body doesn't mean they only express the masculine principle mentally or spiritually, and vice versa. A male scientist might be in a deeply feminine mental state when absorbing complex information. A female entrepreneur might be fully in her masculine principle when launching a bold, risky venture. This principle also played a big role in sacred architecture. The ancient Egyptians designed temples with a masculine outer court, grand, open, projecting, leading to a feminine inner sanctum, enclosed, receptive, hidden. The journey inward mirrored the creative process, an initial burst of energy, narrowing into a protected space where transformation could occur. In the modern world, we've kept the principle, though often unconsciously. In business, a pitch meeting is masculine, projecting ideas outward. The brainstorming session that follows is feminine, letting ideas grow and shift without immediate judgment. In art, the moment inspiration strikes is masculine. The weeks of refining the piece are feminine. The Hermetic student, trained in this principle, asks, am I initiating when I should be receiving? Am I receiving when I should be initiating? Do I know how to switch between the two? One of the most famous Hermetic metaphors for this is the seed and the soil. The seed, masculine, carries the blueprint. The soil, feminine, provides the environment for that blueprint to unfold. Without the seed, there's nothing to grow. Without the soil, the seed remains potential, never reality. The tricky part is that both principles exist within each of us. And they're not fixed traits, they're tools. You can choose to lead with one and then shift to the other. The danger comes when you over-identify with just one. Too much masculine? You bulldoze through life, leaving a trail of half-built projects. Too much feminine, you wait for perfect conditions that never come. The Kybalion ends its teaching on gender with a reminder. Mastery comes from balance. The adept is not ruled by either principle, but uses each deliberately. This is what ancient magicians meant when they said, "He who understands gender understands creation." Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every piece of music, melody, masculine over harmony, feminine. Every conversation, speaking, masculine, listening, feminine. Even the breath, inhale, masculine, exhale, feminine. It's not about biology. It's about the cosmic dance that's been going on since before the first atom formed. And in the Hermetic tradition, if you can master that dance, you can create in your life, your mind and your spirit with the precision of the universe itself. And with that, the Kybalion's 7 principles are complete. But the story isn't over, because the real question is, how did this little book published anonymously in 1908 become the torchbearer of ancient Hermetic wisdom? That trail takes us through secret societies, mysterious authors, and a century of influence that shaped everything from New Age spirituality to modern self-help. By the time you close the Kybalion, you're left with 2 strong impressions. 1. These 7 Hermetic principles feel ancient, like they've been sitting in the cosmic instruction manual since the beginning of time. 2. The book itself feels like it appeared out of nowhere, and in a way it did. The year was 1908. The setting, Chicago, Illinois. On the surface, the city was all steel, smoke and hustle. Beneath it, a growing subculture of spiritual seekers was experimenting with seances, theosophy, occult societies, and mind science, a movement claiming that thought could shape reality. Then, seemingly overnight, a slim black book appeared on shelves. It had no flashy cover, no author photo, no introduction from a famous scholar. The only credit, by 3 initiates. No names, no bios, no explanations. This anonymity wasn't an accident. In the book's own preface, the authors say they were not seeking fame, only to pass on the Hermetic teachings to those ready for the truth. And here's where the speculation begins. Some say the 3 initiates were members of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, an esoteric order operating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Others believe it was the work of William Walker Atkinson, a Chicago-based lawyer turned occult writer who published dozens of books on mentalism and New Thought under different pseudonyms. The Atkinson theory has some weight. His writing style, crisp, direct, almost like a lecture, is all over the Kybalion. He was also fascinated with synthesizing Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and modern psychology. And if he was one of the initiates, anonymity might have been his way of making the book feel timeless, unlinked to a single human personality. Still, no one has ever produced hard evidence, which, of course, only makes the book's mystique stronger. The timing of the Kybalion's release is suspicious too. The early 1900s were a golden age for secret societies and mystery schools in the West. The Theosophical Society was translating Eastern texts. Rosicrucians were claiming links to Egyptian wisdom. Freemasons were weaving Hermetic symbols into their degrees. The Kybalion stood out because it wasn't weighed down by ritual, passwords, or organizational politics. It didn't ask you to join anything. It just handed you the keys, the 7 principles, and left you to test them for yourself. That accessibility is likely why the book spread quietly but steadily. It wasn't a bestseller in its time. It was more like a whispered recommendation. Someone in a spiritual study group might hand you a copy and say, "Read this, but don't just read it. Think about it." The choice of Kybalion as a title is interesting too, a name that I have butchered so many times in this video. It sounds ancient, but it's not an Egyptian or Greek word you'll find in history books. Some researchers think it's a play on Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, combined with Hermes from Hermeticism. The authors never define it, saying only that it means the essence of the Hermetic teachings. Then there's the question of where the content really came from. The Kybalion claims to be distilling the Hermetic philosophy of ancient Egypt and Greece, and indeed you can trace the 7 principles back to earlier sources. The principle of mentalism echoes the Corpus Hermeticum, a set of Greek-Egyptian mystical texts from around the 2nd century CE. The principle of correspondence shows up in both the Emerald Tablet of Hermes and the medieval occult motto, "As above, so below." The law of rhythm appears in Stoic philosophy, Taoism, and Hindu cosmology. But the way the Kybalion packages them, as 7 neat, clearly labeled laws, seems to be a 20th century invention. That's part of its genius. Ancient texts are often cryptic, symbolic, and scattered. The Kybalion turns them into something you can write on an index card and keep in your wallet. Of course, skeptics argue that this neatness makes it more of a new thought manual than a direct transmission of ancient Hermeticism, and they're not entirely wrong. The Kybalion is as much a product of its time with its early self-help flavor as it is of ancient philosophy. Yet here's the strange part. Whether or not it's an unbroken line from the Temple of Thoth, it works. People who apply the principles notice shifts in their thinking, their relationships, even their sense of control over life. That's why it's still in print over a century later. And maybe that's the ultimate hermetic trick. The source doesn't matter as much as the application. Whether the three initiates were ancient adepts reincarnated in Chicago, or just clever writers channeling timeless ideas, they managed to craft something that slips past skepticism and lodges in the mind like a seed. Which brings us to the bigger mystery. How exactly did the Kybalion survive the volatile spiritual marketplace of the last 100 years, and even grow in influence? The answer involves a chain of underground teachers, the post-war occult revival, and an unlikely alliance between paperback publishers and mystics. That's where we'll go next. When a book is born in mystery, it tends to grow in mystery. The Kybalion was never a mass-market phenomenon in its early decades. There were no newspaper ads screaming "Discover the 7 ancient laws of the universe." Instead, it spread like contraband wisdom, handed from seeker to seeker, sometimes in secret, sometimes with a wink. The first step in its survival was its perfect compatibility with occult study groups of the early 20th century. Hermetic societies, Masonic lodges, theosophical circles, and small meditation clubs were always on the lookout for material that felt both profound and accessible. The Kybalion was short enough to read in a week, but dense enough that you could spend months debating what each principle really meant. Freemasons liked it because it framed universal laws without clashing with their own allegories. Theosophists liked it because it echoed their synthesis of Eastern and Western thought. Even the early Rosicrucian order Amorcs slipped Kybalion concepts into their lessons without formally naming the book. But here's the strange thing. The Kybalion didn't need official endorsement. It thrived in oral transmission. A lodge member might summarize the 7 principles in their own words, passing them along to someone who'd never even seen the book. In that way, the Kybalion's ideas spread far wider than its actual text. By the mid-20th century, the occult scene shifted again. World War II had broken people's faith in traditional institutions, and the post-war boom gave rise to a new wave of metaphysical curiosity. Astrology, yoga, and mind power books filled small metaphysical shops across the US and Europe. The Kybalion, quietly reprinted by independent publishers, fit perfectly into this mix. One of the key turning points came in the 1960s. The counterculture embraced anything that hinted at breaking free from the straight world. Acid trips, meditation retreats, and Hermetic philosophy became part of the same spiritual buffet. The Kybalion's principle of mentalism, the all is mind, the universe is mental, sounded like it could have come from a psychedelic experience. Timothy Leary didn't quote it, but plenty of his readers stumbled onto it and felt it validated their own visions. In the underground press, references to the 7 principles began to pop up without attribution. As above, so below became almost a counterculture slogan, used in art, music, and poetry. Few knew it came from the Emerald Tablet, and was reinforced by the Kybalion, but the seed was there. By the 1970s, the New Age movement turned what had been fringe into a thriving commercial niche. You could now buy quartz crystals, herbal teas, and a copy of the Kybalion, all in one shopping trip. Its anonymity became a selling point. A book from nowhere felt more magical than one written by a guy with an author photo and a mailing address. The paperback revolution helped too. Before, small occult titles might sell a few hundred copies. With the rise of mass-market paperbacks, the Kybalion could slip into bookstores and be bought for the price of lunch. Cheap print runs meant it could be reissued endlessly without a marketing push. And here's a fascinating footnote. The Kybalion avoided the fate of many esoteric books that get tied to a single guru's brand. Because no one could attach it to a living personality, it stayed fresh. No scandals, no public fallouts, no messy human drama to taint the teachings. The book itself became the personality. In the 1980s and 90s, as personal development merged with spirituality, the Kybalion quietly influenced the self-help boom. You can hear echoes of the law of correspondence in Tony Robbins' metaphors, or the law of cause and effect in Stephen Covey's proactive mindset. Did they directly read the Kybalion? Maybe, maybe not. But the principles had seeped so deeply into the culture that they often arrived through second and third-hand sources. The internet era only amplified this diffusion. In the early 2000s, scanned PDFs of the Kybalion began circulating on forums. Spiritual bloggers summarized the 7 laws in listicle form. YouTube channels animated them into short explainer videos. The anonymity, once a mysterious barrier, became an asset in the age of viral content. You could present the Kybalion as lost wisdom without anyone fact-checking you. Of course, with online attention came oversimplification. The 7 principles began appearing on Pinterest boards in pastel fonts, stripped of context. Vibration became a lifestyle hashtag. The depth of the Hermetic tradition often got flattened into manifestation hacks. But even in this diluted form, the Kybalion's DNA remained intact. The laws still had a way of worming into people's thinking. And that brings us to a paradox. The Kybalion is both a deeply specific work rooted in Hermetic philosophy and a universal template that anyone can adapt. That's why it could live in an occult temple in 1920, a hippie commune in 1969, a corporate seminar in 1985, and an Instagram reel in 2023 without losing its core. In a way, that's the ultimate proof of its Hermetic nature. It adapts to the container it's placed in. Like water, it takes the shape of whatever vessel it enters, without changing its essence. But behind this adaptability lies something we haven't addressed yet, the content itself. We've danced around the 7 principles, but now it's time to walk through each one, where they came from, and why they still matter. And that's exactly where we're headed next. If the Kybalion had a first domino, this is it. The all is mind, the universe is mental. It sounds like something your stoner roommate might say after 2 hours of staring at the ceiling. But in Hermeticism, this is the foundation everything else rests on. And the idea isn't just a motivational poster. It's a cosmological claim. The universe in its entirety is the product of a vast, infinite consciousness. Not in consciousness, not shaped by consciousness. It is consciousness. This isn't a modern self-help twist. The Kybalion's authors were pulling from ancient Hermetic texts like the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet, where the all, sometimes described as the mind of God, is the primal substance. Everything physical is just a condensation of this mind stuff. To really get this, picture ancient Egypt. You're standing in a temple lit by oil lamps, walls covered in hieroglyphs that depict gods holding the world in their thoughts. The priests weren't playing around with metaphor here. They meant it literally. Reality is a thought form projected by a divine mind. The Greeks picked this up too. Plato's theory of forms? Very mentalism. He suggested that the world we see is just a shadow of perfect, unchanging ideas that exist in an invisible realm. Aristotle, less mystical, more logic-driven, still couldn't completely escape the pull of the idea that mind organizes matter. Fast forward to the Renaissance, when Hermeticism came roaring back into Europe through translations of Greek and Arabic texts. Thinkers like Giordano Bruno and Marsilio Ficino absorbed the mentalism idea into their cosmologies. For them, studying the universe was like reading the mind of God. Dangerous stuff in an era when the church preferred you to take God's words second-hand. Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600, partly for suggesting the divine mind might be infinite and everywhere. But the mentalism principle didn't vanish with him. It quietly threaded its way through Western thought. Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," but Hermeticists countered, "The all thinks, therefore everything is." By the time the Kybalion put it in print in 1908, the world was primed for it. The New Thought movement, a blend of metaphysics, positive thinking, and watered-down mysticism, was telling people that their thoughts could shape reality. Mentalism was the philosophical big brother to this trend. It didn't just say you can manifest your life, it said the entire cosmos operates on that principle. Here's where the Kybalion's authors made their smartest move. They framed mentalism as a practical tool. If the universe is mental, then learning how thought works is the ultimate skill. You're not just reacting to the world, you're influencing it at its most fundamental level. This is why in Hermetic circles, the mind is seen as both a laboratory and a battlefield. A disciplined mind can align itself with the all and operate in harmony with the laws of nature. An undisciplined mind gets tossed around like driftwood, reacting to every random mental current it encounters. Of course, mentalism has always had critics. Materialists call it a poetic way of avoiding hard science. But interestingly, modern physics with its quantum weirdness has given the idea a strange kind of comeback. Experiments like the double slit test suggest that observation affects outcomes. Hermeticists smirk at this. They've been saying for centuries, mind moves matter. But the Kybalions' point isn't to argue with scientists. It's to hand you a kind of operating manual. If everything is mental, then the quality of your inner world matters. Not just for your mood, but for the shape of your reality. Now, here's where people trip over mentalism. It's not about wishful thinking. It's not imagine a Ferrari and it will appear. The Kybalion insists on harmony with the other 6 principles. Mentalism gives you the clay, the other laws tell you how to mold it without it collapsing. Think of it like this. The all is the infinite screen. Your mind is the projector. But the film running through it, your beliefs, emotions, habits determines the story you get to watch. If you're showing a horror reel, you can't complain that the screen isn't playing a rom-com. For the Hermetic student, practicing mentalism means taking radical responsibility for the content you feed into the universal mind. Meditation, visualization, deliberate thought, these aren't just nice-to-have wellness tips. They're you learning to code in the operating system of reality. The Kybalion leaves it deliberately abstract here. It doesn't tell you what to think. It just tells you that thought is the fundamental creative force. The moral content is up to you. That's empowering and a little dangerous. After all, the same principle that builds a cathedral can build a prison camp depending on the mind behind it. This is why ancient teachers wrapped mentalism in ethics. If you're going to play in the mind of God, you'd better be clear about the story you're contributing to. And with that, the Kybalion moves to the second law, the one that shows how mental creations actually move from the invisible to the visible. The principle of correspondence. If mentalism is the big why of the universe, correspondence is the how. The Kybalion sums it up in a single cryptic line. So, as above, so below, as below, so above. It's one of those phrases that has been slapped on coffee mugs, Instagram quotes and crystal shop posters. But in Hermeticism, it's far more than aesthetic. It's the blueprint for how reality organizes itself. The idea is deceptively simple. Patterns repeat. The small reflects the large. The microcosm mirrors the macrocosm. And if you can understand the laws that operate on one level, you can infer how they work on all levels. This isn't just spiritual poetry. It's how ancient science worked. When Egyptian priests charted the stars, they weren't just being astronomers. They believed the movement of celestial bodies reflected the movement of life on Earth. A flood in the Nile could be read in the heavens. A shift in the human spirit could be mapped in the constellations. The Greeks absorbed this principle wholesale. Pythagoras, the math mystic of ancient Greece, believed numbers revealed the harmony of both the cosmos and the soul. The human body, to him, was a scaled-down version of the universe, organs as planets, blood flow as orbital paths. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and you find Paracelsus, the Swiss physician-alchemist, prescribing cures by studying the signatures of plants. A walnut looked like a brain? Must be good for the mind. It sounds quaint now, but his approach was rooted in correspondence. Nature speaks in repeating patterns, if you know how to listen. The Kybalion's authors in 1908 weren't breaking new ground here. They were codifying a principle that had been floating around for thousands of years. Their contribution was to put it into a portable mental tool. If you're struggling to understand a situation, look for its parallel in another domain. Here's the practical beauty of correspondence. It's a bridge between the invisible and the visible. If everything is mentalism, then correspondence is the translator, turning thoughts into form and form back into thought. Think about how this shows up everywhere once you see it. Fractals in nature, coastlines, leaves, clouds, endlessly repeating the same shapes at different scales. Music harmonics mirror themselves in octaves. Human psychology, the dynamics in a family, often echo in a company or a nation. Modern science, ironically, has circled back to correspondence without using the word. Chaos theory, systems thinking, and holographic models of the universe all describe a reality where each part contains the whole. Physicist David Bohm talked about the implicate order, where every bit of the universe contains the blueprint of everything else. Hermeticists nod at this and say, yes, that's what we've been trying to tell you. But there's a twist. The Kybalion warns that correspondence isn't always obvious. Patterns can be distorted. Mirrors can be warped. The trick is learning discernment, knowing when two things are genuinely linked versus when you're forcing a metaphor. For example, seeing that planetary cycles affect mood is classic correspondence. Believing Mercury retrograde is why your microwave stopped working might be a stretch. Unless, of course, your microwave happens to be a metaphor for your communication habits. Then, maybe. One of the most famous uses of correspondence in occult circles is the concept of the 7 planes: physical, mental, and spiritual realms, each with sub-levels. What happens in the spiritual ripples into the mental, then crystallizes in the physical. The Kybalion leans heavily on this model without drawing it out in diagrams, expecting the reader to intuit the connections. This is also why correspondence is a favorite among magicians, mystics, and, yes, corporate strategists. If you can master a principle in one domain, you can replicate it elsewhere. A general who understands the terrain of a battlefield can apply that same logic to navigating political conflict. A gardener who learns the cycles of planting can use those rhythms to time business moves. But correspondence also carries a warning. The way you behave on the small scale reflects in the big picture. Treat people with pettiness in daily life, and that vibration echoes into the larger structures you inhabit. You're not just a participant in the macrocosm, you're a contributor. In a way, this principle is quietly radical. It suggests that by working on yourself, your microcosm, you can affect the whole. Fix the pattern here and the ripple travels outward. This is why Hermetic teachers have always emphasized inner work before outer work. Trying to fix the world while neglecting your own distortions is like cleaning a mirror with dirty hands. The Kybalion doesn't overcomplicate it. They give you the phrase, the framing, and then frustratingly for some, they move on, leaving you to apply it. This is deliberate. Correspondence isn't something you memorize, it's something you start to notice. Once you do, it changes how you see everything. The authors also drop a sly implication. If you can use correspondence to understand the all, you can also use it to influence it. This is where it brushes up against magic, not as hocus pocus, but as the art of working with patterns consciously instead of unconsciously. And this sets the stage perfectly for the third Hermetic principle, vibration. Because if everything corresponds, then everything also moves. Nothing rests, and understanding that motion is the key to shaping the patterns you've just learnt to recognize. If correspondence explains the patterns of the universe, vibration explains the pulse. The Kybalion states it bluntly. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. At first glance, that sounds like something you'd see in a motivational Instagram reel with a guy in yoga pants telling you to raise your frequency. But the Hermetic meaning runs deeper and far older. To the ancients, vibration wasn't just a poetic metaphor for energy. It was a literal truth. Everything from the densest rock to the most abstract thought is in constant motion. The difference between forms is not what they're made of, but the rate at which they vibrate. The Egyptian priests had a saying, "Life is the breath between the beats." They believed the gods themselves tuned the vibrations of the universe, like harp strings resonating to different notes. Creation was music, and we were living inside the song. The Greeks picked up on this through Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy again, who famously declared, "All is number." For him, number meant harmony, and harmony meant vibration. He taught that the planets themselves moved in a grand symphony called the music of the spheres, an idea that haunted Western mysticism for centuries. Fast forward to the 19th century, and you have scientists like James Clerk Maxwell discovering the electromagnetic spectrum, showing that light, heat, and radio waves were all forms of vibration. Suddenly, what the Hermeticists had been saying for millennia didn't sound mystical, it sounded scientific. The Kybalion's authors weren't physicists, but they understood the principle in a way modern science was just catching up to. Everything from your thoughts to your bones exists because of vibration. Change the vibration, and you change the thing itself. They also made an important distinction. Higher vibrations tend toward spirit, lower vibrations toward matter. But, and here's where they jab at the lazy mystic, one is not better than the other. Both are necessary. A pure spirit with no grounding is as useless as a lump of matter with no spark. The goal is not to escape the lower vibrations, but to work consciously with the whole spectrum. Think about it this way. Ice, water, and steam are all the same substance, H2O existing at different rates of molecular vibration. The difference between a block of ice and a cloud is simply the speed at which its molecules move. The same applies to thought and matter in the Hermetic view. This principle also feeds directly into ancient healing practices. The shamans of Africa, the Vedic sages of India, and the medicine priests of the Americas all used sound, chanting, drumming, singing bowls to alter the vibrational state of a person. They didn't need to understand wave mechanics, they could feel the shift. In the modern world, vibration theory has crept into everything from quantum physics to pop spirituality. High-frequency trading on Wall Street? Still vibration, just in data form. The hum of your phone? Vibration. The music that gets stuck in your head for 3 days? Definitely vibration. But the Kybalion pushes the principle further. If you understand vibration, you can master it. That means changing your mental state at will, influencing the mental states of others, even altering physical matter in subtle ways. This is where the line between Hermetic philosophy and what people call magic blurs into a smudge. The authors hint at masters who could raise their vibration so high they could pass through solid matter, or lower it so much they became imperceptible to others. They don't expect you to believe this literally, although some do. But they're making a point. Control over vibration equals control over experience. And here's where it gets practical. Ever notice how your mood can shift the feel of a room? Walk in with tension, and suddenly everyone else is tighter. Show up relaxed and centered, and the room eases. That's vibration in action. Your personal frequency is contagious, whether you intend it or not. The Kybalion encourages deliberate tuning. Want to shift fear into courage? Change the vibration of your thoughts. This isn't just positive thinking, it's frequency management. Want to manifest something? Match the vibration of the result you want, not the one you have. This is also why raising your vibration isn't about forcing yourself to be happy all the time. That's just denial in a prettier outfit. It's about learning to move through the spectrum consciously, knowing when to rise and when to ground. Historically, this principle may be the most widely misunderstood. The New Thought movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which heavily influenced the Kybalion, took the idea and ran with it, sometimes straight into pseudoscience. They turned vibration into a catch-all excuse. Sick, your vibration is low. Broke, same. Lost your job, must have been bad vibes. The original Hermetic view is more nuanced. Yes, vibration influences everything, but you're not a god pressing buttons in a control room. You're part of a massive interconnected orchestra. You can change your instrument's pitch, but the symphony still plays as a whole. And, just like in music, sometimes the most beautiful moments come from tension resolving into harmony. Without contrast, without the low notes, the high ones have no meaning. The Kybalion closes its section on vibration with a reminder. Those who understand the principle have the key to the door of the temple. That temple isn't a place you visit. It's the experience of moving through life, aware of the rhythm beneath everything. And just when you think you've grasped it, they hit you with the next principle. Polarity. The truth that everything has its opposite, and those opposites are really just extremes of the same thing. Vibration. In other words, sets the stage for polarity to play out. If polarity tells you life swings between two ends of a spectrum, rhythm is the reminder that it doesn't just swing, it keeps swinging. The Kybalion says, everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall, the pendulum swing manifests in everything. The Hermeticists saw the universe as a giant pendulum. Everything, your moods, your successes, your relationships, even civilizations, swings back and forth between extremes. The principle of rhythm isn't about predicting exact dates, but about recognizing that cycles rule everything. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with rhythm, and not just in music. The Nile's annual flood was the lifeblood of their civilization. Too little water and famine came, too much and crops were destroyed. To them this wasn't random chance. It was the pulse of a cosmic heart. Life itself was a series of predictable tides. The Greeks, picking up from Egyptian and Babylonian knowledge, embedded rhythm into their philosophy. Plato wrote about the Great Year, a vast cosmic cycle after which events repeat in a new form. The Stoics, ever practical, advised that if you know the pendulum swings, you shouldn't cling too tightly to the ups, nor despair too deeply in the downs. The Kybalion pushes this further. The pendulum swing in one direction equals the swing in the opposite. In other words, the higher your highs, the lower your lows, unless you learn the Hermetic skill of neutralization. Neutralization doesn't mean flatlining your emotions like some kind of robot. It means stepping outside the pendulum's path, so its swing doesn't hit you as hard. Think of it like sitting in the middle of a boat during a storm instead of right on the edge where the waves smack you. Here's a practical example. You land a big deal at work. You're riding high. But if you know the principle of rhythm, you also know a slowdown might be coming. Instead of blowing all your money celebrating, you prepare. Or, on the flip side, if you're in a slump, you remind yourself the pendulum will swing back toward opportunity. Historically, rulers and strategists have used rhythm to their advantage. Ancient Chinese war manuals advised striking during the enemy's downswing, when their morale or resources were low, and retreating or consolidating during their upswing. It wasn't just about brute force, it was about catching the wave at the right moment. Nature runs on rhythm too: seasons, lunar cycles, migration patterns, even the human heartbeat. The Hermeticists taught that to live in harmony with the universe, you had to align yourself with these natural rhythms instead of fighting them. Sailors have always known this. You don't fight the tide, you work with it. Where it gets really interesting and slightly unnerving is when you apply rhythm to civilizations. Historians like Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee noticed that empires seem to follow the same pattern: rise, peak, decline, collapse. Egypt, Rome, the British Empire. The principle of rhythm suggests this isn't a coincidence, it's a universal law. The Kybalion's authors weren't shy about saying the same thing applies to your personal life. Your energy, focus, and motivation aren't static. They come in waves. If you pretend they don't, you burn out. If you anticipate the wave, you can ride it further. Humorously enough, rhythm even shows up in human arguments. You'll notice people often swing between positions during a heated debate, first attacking hard, then softening, then doubling down. A skilled negotiator knows to let the swing play out before making their real move. The Hermetic warning is that the swing toward the negative often follows the swing toward the positive, and vice versa. So the more wildly you chase the highs, the more brutal the lows can feel. That's why the masters practiced moderation, not because they didn't enjoy life, but because they understood the pendulum's toll. In Eastern traditions, rhythm is everywhere. The Tao Te Ching says returning is the motion of the Tao. The breath itself, inhale, exhale, is a microcosm of the principle. Buddhists meditate on impermanence partly to accept rhythm's inevitability. Everything changes, nothing stays. There's also a deeper Hermetic teaching. Rhythm doesn't mean you're trapped. Yes, the pendulum swings, but awareness lets you step off the ride when it serves you. This is why seasoned traders in financial markets don't panic at crashes. They know the swing will reverse, and why experienced farmers don't curse winter. They know spring is coming. One of the best historical illustrations of this is the ages of man described by the ancient Greeks, and echoed in Hindu yugas. Humanity cycles through golden, silver, bronze, and dark ages, only to rise again. To the Hermeticists, this was rhythm on the grandest scale, the breath of the universe itself. The danger, of course, is forgetting the downswing is inevitable when you're in an upswing. This is how economies crash, how overconfident leaders fall, how personal lives unravel after a period of success. Rhythm is merciless to those who ignore it. But the opportunity is just as big. If you can time your moves with the swing, you become almost untouchable. You don't fight the tide, you surf it. The Kybalion closes its section on rhythm with this advice. The master neutralizes the swing of the pendulum, which would carry him to the opposite pole. He stands firm in his knowledge of the principle. In other words, don't waste energy trying to stop the pendulum. Learn to stand where its swing has the least effect. Or better yet, learn to predict its motion so you can be exactly where you need to be when it comes back around. With rhythm understood, the path leads naturally to the sixth principle, cause and effect, which answers the question, if everything swings and flows, who or what is pushing the pendulum in the first place? If rhythm tells you life swings, cause and effect tells you why. The Kybalion states it plainly. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. In other words, nothing just happens. That lucky break you got? There's a chain of causes behind it. That disaster you didn't see coming? Same thing, causes, just outside your awareness. The Hermeticists insisted that the universe is lawful. Not lawful in a courtroom sense, but in the way physics is lawful. Drop an apple, it falls. Strike a match, it burns. But they pushed the idea further than modern science often dares, into the mental and spiritual realms. In ancient Egypt, this principle showed up as Maat, the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Maat wasn't just about morality. She represented the underlying law that kept the sun rising, the Nile flowing, and society functioning. Pharaohs were seen as enforcers of Maat, not because they personally made the laws of nature, but because they ruled in alignment with them. Greek philosophy picked up the torch. Aristotle taught that everything has a first cause, a mover that sets the chain in motion. The Stoics believed that fate was simply the chain of causes extending through time, and that wisdom was in aligning your will with it instead of fighting it. But the Kybalion added something the philosophers didn't always emphasize. You can be either a cause or an effect in life. Most people, it says, are effects. They're pushed around by circumstances, habits, and the actions of others. The few who rise to the level of conscious cause are the ones who seem to control life. This is where Hermeticism slides into power dynamics. Think about a chessboard. Most players react to moves, their effects. The masters set traps 6 moves ahead, their causes. In history, leaders like Alexander the Great or Cleopatra didn't just react to events, they engineered them. The Kybalion urges you to step into that role. Not in a control-everything way, which is impossible, but in the sense of recognizing where you can initiate instead of responding. Ancient strategists were obsessed with cause and effect. Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, "Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win." Translation: they caused the victory before the battle even started, through positioning, alliances, deception, and timing. This principle also has a more personal dimension. Hermeticists believed your thoughts are causes, not in the vague just think positive sense, but in the real psychological way. Thoughts lead to actions, actions lead to habits, and habits lead to outcomes. Ignore the root cause and you'll keep repeating the same effects. The Kybalion makes a point. Nothing escapes the principle of cause and effect, but there are many planes of causation. This means the chain of causes exists on the physical level. Drop a rock, it falls. The mental level, beliefs shaping decisions, and the spiritual level, deeper patterns that even mental habits arise from. In ancient India, this dovetailed with the concept of karma, not as cosmic punishment, but as the law of action and consequence. Do something, and a ripple is created. That ripple will return to you, maybe in this life, maybe in another. Here's a historical illustration. The fall of the Roman Empire wasn't one cause, it was hundreds. Political corruption, overexpansion, economic instability, invading tribes, reliance on mercenaries, and even lead poisoning in the water supply. Each was an effect of earlier causes, which themselves had causes. It's like tracing back a family tree until you reach the original ancestor, except the ancestor here is often human greed, ignorance, or ambition. Humorously, the principle of cause and effect also explains why people keep touching hot stoves even after being told not to. The cause isn't they didn't know, it's usually curiosity or disbelief until direct experience burns it in. Literally, the Hermetic masters didn't claim you could escape cause and effect, but they believed you could rise to higher planes of causation, meaning you could operate from a level where you set more causes in motion than most. Think of it as playing the game from a higher balcony while everyone else is stuck on the ground floor. They also warned against living in superstition. People often mistake correlation for cause. You wear a lucky ring to an interview, get the job, and assume the ring caused it. Hermetic thought would say, no, your preparation, confidence, and timing did. The ring was an effect, not a cause. Where the principle gets really powerful is in relationships and negotiations. If you want someone to act a certain way, you don't push them directly. You create the causes, the environment, the incentives, the framing, that make the action the natural effect. Great leaders, marketers, and even con artists all use this. The Kybalion compares this to a skilled billiard player. The amateur just hits the ball toward the pocket. The master hits in a way that also sets up the next shot. It's not magic, it's anticipation of causes and effects. This principle also ties back to the earlier ones. Mentalism? Your mind is a cause. Correspondence? Causes mirror across planes. Vibration? The frequency you operate on shapes the kinds of causes you set in motion. Polarity and rhythm? They determine the kind of swings and counterswings those causes create. Perhaps the most empowering part of this principle is realizing you can start chains at will. Write one email, make one introduction, plant one idea, and months later, watch effects ripple back to you in ways you couldn't fully predict. The Kybalion leaves us with this challenge. The masses of people are carried along, obedient to environment, the wills and desires of others stronger than themselves, heredity, suggestion, and other outward causes moving them about like pawns on the chessboard of life. But the masters rising to the plane above dominate their moods, character, qualities, and powers, as well as the environment surrounding them, and become movers instead of pawns. Which leads us to the 7th and final principle, gender, the one that most people misunderstand entirely. And no, it's not about what you think. When most modern readers hear gender, they think of biology, identity, or social roles. The Kybalion? It's talking about something far older and broader, a universal law that, according to the Hermetic Masters, operates in everything from atoms to galaxies. The text states, "Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests on all planes." Hermetic gender isn't about male or female people. It's about dual creative forces. In the physical world, those forces do appear as male and female. But on mental and spiritual planes, they're more like two complementary modes, the active masculine and the receptive feminine. Ancient Egypt expressed this in its gods. Osiris masculine and Isis feminine weren't just a divine couple, they were cosmic principles, structure and flow, seed and soil, sun and moon. Without both, creation stalls. The Greeks mirrored this in their myths, Uranus and Gaia, the sky and the earth, producing life through their union. Even in science, the metaphor holds. In electricity, you need a positive and a negative charge for current to flow. In magnetism, there's a north and a south pole. In chemistry, atoms marry when one provides electrons and the other accepts them, forming bonds. The Hermetic Masters said mental creation works the same way. The masculine principle initiates its will, direction, the spark of an idea. The feminine principle receives, nurtures, and brings that idea into form. A brilliant plan, masculine, is useless without execution and care, feminine. A burst of inspiration is nothing without the patience to develop it. Throughout history, cultures have encoded this principle without always naming it. In Chinese philosophy, it's yin and yang. In Hindu thought, it's Shiva and Shakti. In alchemy, it's the Red King and the White Queen. The forms change, but the core insight is the same. Creation needs both forces. The Kybalion warns about imbalance. Too much masculine energy in the mind, endless initiating without receptivity, and you burn out or scatter your focus. Too much feminine energy, endless receptivity without initiating, and you stagnate, waiting for someone else to start the process. Mastery is learning to balance both in yourself, regardless of your physical sex. One of the fascinating historical threads is how this principle was weaponized. In politics and persuasion, masculine energy is used to project authority, while feminine energy draws people in subtly. Cleopatra was a master of both, commanding when needed, disarmingly receptive when it served her. Leaders who understood this duality could adapt to any audience. On a deeper level, Hermeticists believed spiritual awakening itself required an inner marriage, the integration of the active and receptive within your own consciousness. They called this the sacred union. Alchemists symbolized it as the konionxor, the merging of sun and moon into the philosopher's stone, the perfected self. Even the building of great civilizations reflected this principle. Rome expanded through masculine action, conquest, infrastructure, lawmaking, but it was sustained by feminine reception, absorbing other cultures, integrating their gods, art and knowledge. Remove one, and the system collapses. The Kybalion also makes an unusual claim. Gender manifests on all planes. This means even in the spiritual realm, creation requires a polarity. On the mental plane, the masculine principle sends thought forms. The feminine receives them and gives them life. On the physical plane, we see it in reproduction. On the spiritual plane, it's the interplay between divine will and divine nurturing. If that sounds abstract, here's a grounded analogy. Think of a film production. The masculine energy is the director, vision, orders, deadlines. The feminine energy is the producer, managing resources, handling details, ensuring the vision survives real-world challenges. Without one, the film is chaos. Without the other, it never leaves the page. In daily life, you see the principle everywhere once you look for it. A startup founder, masculine, pitches the big idea. A project manager, feminine, builds the systems to make it work. A teacher, masculine, delivers knowledge. A student, feminine, absorbs and transforms it into skill. In reality, both people have both energies in different moments. The founder must also listen. The student must also act. The Hermetic Masters also gave a warning. Misuse of the gender principle leads to manipulation. Playing masculine too hard can turn into domination. Playing feminine too hard can turn into passive control, influence through guilt, seduction, or withholding. The most dangerous manipulators blend both seamlessly, switching as needed. Understanding this principle isn't just mystical, it's practical. It explains why some partnerships thrive, the energies complement. It explains why some fail, both parties try to initiate without listening, or both wait for the other to move. The Kybalion's closing thought on gender ties the 7 principles together. Mentalism? Gender describes how thought becomes reality. Correspondence? The masculine-feminine interplay happens in the same way on every plane. Vibration? Each energy has its frequency. Polarity? Masculine and feminine are a polarity. Rhythm? They swing in dominance over time. Cause and effect, one initiates, the other completes. In the end, the principle of gender isn't about people, it's about creation itself. Everything that exists came into being because two forces, one that acts and one that receives, met and danced. And with that, the Kybalion closes its list of 7. But our story isn't done. In the next part, we'll explore how these principles work together, and how the text's mysterious authors intended them to be used. By now, we've walked through the entire Hermetic map, from mentalism's declaration that all is mind, to gender's reminder that creation itself is a duet. But the Kybalion wasn't meant to be read as 7 separate curiosities. It was designed like a lock, each principle a tumbling pin. Only when all align does the mechanism click open. The Hermetic masters didn't list them in random order. They start with the broadest truth, mentalism, and work down to the most specific manifestation, gender. It's like zooming in from the cosmic blueprint to the nuts and bolts of how reality gets built. Let's put them side by side and see what emerges. 1. Mentalism. The mind as the origin. Everything begins as thought. That doesn't mean you can levitate your landlord's cat by thinking hard enough. It means the raw material of existence, whether a building, a culture, or a galaxy, starts as an idea in some mind. In your life, every change begins when you change the way you think. 2. Correspondence. The universe as a fractal. As above, so below. As below, so above. This is the Hermetic way of saying patterns repeat. The solar system is a cosmic version of the atom. Your habits are the personal version of global trends. Spotting these mirrors lets you predict outcomes before they happen. 3. Vibration. Nothing rests. From your heartbeat to the spin of electrons, movement is the rule. Every emotion, sound, and object has its frequency. Change the vibration, change the reality. This principle connects directly to the more mystical practices, chanting, sound healing, and even certain breathing exercises, all aimed at tuning your frequency. 4. Polarity. Everything has 2 poles. Hot and cold are just degrees of temperature. Love and hate are degrees of emotion. Recognizing this turns enemies into opportunities. If you can slide along the scale, you can transform one into the other. 5. Rhythm. The pendulum swings. This is nature's metronome. Economies boom and bust. Empires rise and fall. Your energy levels peak and dip. Fighting the swing just exhausts you. Mastery is about timing your actions with the rhythm instead of against it. 6. Cause and effect. Nothing just happens. Hermeticism rejects luck as an excuse. There's always a chain of causes. You can either be at the mercy of those causes, or learn to set them in motion yourself. Gender. The dance of creation. The active and receptive. The initiating and the nurturing. Both are required. Whether you're starting a business, raising a child, or meditating, you're playing both roles. Now here's the important part. These principles don't live in isolation. They weave together into a single operating system. Take the example of building a great city, say, ancient Alexandria. Mentalism. Ptolemy dreamed of a city that would be the intellectual capital of the world. Correspondence. He mirrored its layout after other great cities but scaled it to be grander. Vibration. The city buzzed with scholars, merchants, and sailors, its energy attracting more. Polarity. It balanced Greek and Egyptian cultures, uniting 2 ends of a spectrum. Rhythm. It rose in prosperity during times of trade flow and adjusted during political shifts. Cause and effect policies, alliances, and innovations drove its growth. Gender. The masculine drive to expand met the feminine ability to absorb and integrate other cultures. Every great movement in history, from the Renaissance to the space race, can be broken down in the same way. The Kybalion isn't telling you to believe in magic. It's giving you a toolkit for reverse engineering reality. But here's where the Hermetic authors slip in their subtle warning. Knowing the principles doesn't mean you control them. They're not buttons you press. They're more like rivers you learn to navigate. Even the greatest masters get caught in the current sometimes. Historically, those who tried to weaponize the laws without balance ended up paying the price. The rise and fall of Napoleon is practically a case study. He mastered mentalism, envisioning himself as emperor before it happened. He understood correspondence, Modeling his rule after Rome, he embodied vibration, inspiring troops through charisma. He exploited polarity, turning enemies into allies, and allies into enemies. But rhythm caught him. Every empire faces decline. Cause and effect was merciless when his actions in Russia triggered disaster. And gender. He leaned heavily on masculine force with little feminine integration, alienating the cultures he conquered. The Kybalion implies that integration is what prevents collapse, not favoring one principle, but keeping all seven in a living balance. If you're imagining this as some mystical juggling act, here's a more grounded analogy. A symphony. Each principle is a section of the orchestra. Strings, brass, woodwinds, percussion. On their own, they're fine. But it's the conductor's job, your job, to make them play together. In modern life, integration might look like this. You have a vision for your career. Mentalism. You learn from people who've done it before. Correspondence. You keep your energy and enthusiasm high. Vibration. You navigate setbacks by shifting perspective. Polarity. You work in tune with market cycles. Rhythm. You take deliberate action to create opportunities, cause and effect. You balance initiative with listening and adaptation. Gender. When you apply all seven, you stop living reactively. You start moving like someone who sees the current before it turns. That's the edge the Hermetic Masters promised. And now, with all seven explored, the Kybalion leaves us at the doorway. The principles are laid out. The question is whether you'll keep them as intellectual souvenirs or step through and live them. In the next part, we'll explore the mystery of who actually wrote the Kybalion and why they chose to remain hidden, because in true Hermetic fashion, the authors may have been just as carefully constructed as the message itself. For more than a century, the Kybalion has been sitting on bookshelves like a mysterious artifact, quietly reshaping minds, all while hiding the fingerprints of its creators. You'll notice the book is credited only to 3 initiates. No names, no biographies, no temple address, just 3 anonymous figures peering out from behind a curtain of ink. Why? In part, it's perfectly in line with the Hermetic tradition. The Kybalion itself tells you that true wisdom isn't about who delivers it, but about the principles themselves. In other words, don't look at the teacher, look at the teaching. But human curiosity is stubborn, and over the decades, researchers have tried to pull back the curtain. Most trails lead to one name, William Walker Atkinson. He was a prolific early 20th century writer, on topics ranging from yoga philosophy to mental science to business success. The man wrote under multiple pseudonyms, sometimes releasing several books a year, each under a different name. If anyone could pull off writing an entire Hermetic text while hiding behind a collective identity, it was him. But here's where things get interesting. Atkinson wasn't just some mystical hobbyist. He was also a practicing attorney, a businessman, and a leading figure in the New Thought movement, the early forerunner of much of today's self-help industry. This meant he had both the legal savvy to keep his name out of it and the marketing instincts to make the Kybalion feel like a timeless treasure rather than just another book. Now, the 3 Initiates title suggests he wasn't alone. Researchers often point to Paul Foster Case, an occultist and founder of the Builders of the Adytum, a mystical order, and Michael Whitty, a less well-known but equally active figure in esoteric circles. The theory is that these 3 pooled their knowledge, Atkinson's writing skill and mental science background, Case's deep symbolic expertise, and Whitty's network in mystical publishing, to create something bigger than any of them could have produced individually. The funny part, none of this is proven. For every researcher who insists Atkinson was behind it, there's another pointing out that the style and content don't perfectly match his other works. Some even suggest the 3 Initiates may have been an even looser collective, a group of Hermetic students compiling older material into a modern format. The secrecy serves another purpose too. In the early 1900s, esoteric knowledge was still viewed with suspicion by mainstream society. Talking too openly about Egyptian mystery schools, reincarnation, or the mind-shaping reality could brand you as a crank, or worse, get you dismissed as a fraud. Anonymity let the authors sidestep that risk. And then there's the marketing genius of it. Imagine you're browsing a bookstore in 1912. You come across a slim, mysterious volume claiming to reveal ancient Hermetic wisdom written by 3 Initiates. The anonymity makes it feel like forbidden knowledge, something passed hand to hand in secret societies, not churned out by a publishing house. You lean in because you want to know what's inside. In that way, the title becomes part of the initiation. Hermeticism itself has always had a bit of a wink to it. The Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, begins with the phrase, "true, without falsehood, certain, and most true," which, ironically, is exactly the kind of thing you'd say if you wanted to get people to start questioning you. The Kybalion continues this tradition, presenting itself as a straightforward guide, but never quite giving you the satisfaction of knowing the whole story. And maybe that's the point. The moment you can fully explain the origins of a teaching, it stops being a mystery and starts being just another piece of history. By remaining anonymous, the three initiates kept the Kybalion alive as a living puzzle. But here's something worth noting. The Kybalion isn't ancient. It's not a relic from a lost Egyptian temple. It's a 20th century creation, a modern distillation of much older ideas. This actually makes it more powerful for a modern reader. Instead of translating from dusty manuscripts, the authors reinterpreted the principles for an industrial age hurtling toward modernity. They bridged the gap between mysticism and the world of factories, telegraphs and typewriters. That's why, even over 100 years later, the book still feels weirdly current. Swap the word telegraph for internet, and the advice fits. Replace phonograph with podcast, and the principles still apply. The authors didn't just preserve Hermeticism, they updated it, wrapped it in an aura of timelessness, and sent it out into the world like a seed that would keep sprouting in new forms. And yet, the anonymity also creates a kind of litmus test. Some readers are frustrated by not knowing the authors, which, ironically, is exactly what the Kybalion warns against, clinging to the messenger instead of the message. Others find the mystery energizing, as if the lack of a face forces them to engage more deeply with the words themselves. Whether the three initiates were Atkinson and his friends, an entirely different trio, or even just one person wearing three masks, the truth may never be nailed down, and maybe that's exactly as they intended. After all, what better way to honor Hermetic wisdom than to embody one of its key ideas? The lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding. In the next part, we'll dig into the hidden structure of the Kybalion itself, the way the text is arranged to subtly mirror the very laws it's teaching, turning the book into a living example of its own philosophy. If you've ever read the Kybalion cover to cover, you'll notice something curious. On the surface, it's just a sequence of chapters explaining each of the 7 Hermetic laws, but if you take a step back, you start to see it's not just about the laws, it's built according to them. It's a little like a magician explaining a trick while performing it right under your nose. You're so focused on the words that you don't notice the form itself is demonstrating the principles in real time. Let's start with the principle of mentalism. The all is mind. The universe is mental. The book opens with this idea because it's the root of everything else. But here's the sneaky part. It's not just telling you reality is mental. It's inducing a mental shift before you even realize it. Those first pages are structured like a hypnotic pre-talk, redefining your idea of reality so the rest of the teachings slip in more smoothly. You're not just reading, you're being primed. Then there's the principle of correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. The Kybalion mirrors this in its layout. Each law is explained both in cosmic terms, how it applies to the universe, and in personal terms, how it applies to you. It's a perfect literary embodiment of the principle, moving up and down the scale between the macro and the micro, so your mind gets used to seeing the links. The principle of vibration shows up in the rhythm of the writing itself. At first you might think the repetition of certain phrases, the law is in operation, nothing rests is just old-fashioned style, but no, it's a deliberate pulse. The pacing of the sentences rises and falls like waves, making the text feel alive, as if you're riding the same energetic principle it's describing. Polarity is baked into the teaching order. The book swings between abstract cosmic laws and concrete mental applications, between spiritual optimism and warnings about misuse. You get light, then shadow, then light again. Not just in content, but in emotional tone. It's a kind of intellectual call and response that keeps your mind from falling asleep. Rhythm appears not just in the sentence patterns, but in the alternation of concepts. Heavy, mind-bending chapters are followed by simpler, grounding sections. The effect is like breathing. Inhale, big ideas. Exhale, practical application. Whether you realize it or not, your attention is being managed. Cause and effect plays out in how the book builds. Each law sets up the next, so you feel the chain of reasoning pulling you forward. There's a logic to it that makes it hard to stop midstream, because you're always about to find out why something works. And then there's gender, the interplay of the masculine and feminine qualities of mind. Even here, the book mirrors the principle in its style. The masculine element comes through in the logical structure, the definition-heavy explanations, and the focus on active mastery. The feminine element flows through the more poetic imagery, the subtle suggestion that you should hold an idea and let it gestate before acting on it. If all of this sounds a little too perfectly aligned to be coincidence, that's the point. The Kybalion isn't just describing Hermetic principles, it's performing them. You could strip the chapter headings entirely and still feel the laws operating in the way the ideas unfold. This makes the book a kind of living talisman. In Hermetic thought, a talisman is an object charged with intention, a symbol that carries a pattern into the mind of whoever encounters it. The Kybalion functions like that on a literary level. Its structure imprints the laws into you, not just through explanation but through form. There's also a subtler layer, the use of delayed revelation. Certain key ideas aren't explained until later chapters, even though earlier ones hint at them. This keeps your subconscious working between readings, the same way a Zenko and nags at you until something clicks. It's the principle of rhythm applied to thought itself. You swing away from the answer before being pulled back to it. It's no accident that the Kybalion became more than just another occult manual. Plenty of books from that era covered similar ground, but they faded into obscurity because they taught about something without embodying it. The Kybalion is different. Reading it is a micro-initiation, a subtle training in how to think hermetically. And maybe that's why the authors stayed anonymous. If the focus had been on personalities, readers might have missed the bigger trick, that the book itself is the real teacher. The three initiates didn't just write a book, they designed a mind device, one that runs its program every time someone opens it. In the next and final teaching section, we'll look at how these Hermetic principles and the Kybalion itself have shaped modern thought far beyond the circles of esoteric study. From self-help to quantum physics metaphors, the fingerprints are everywhere. You might think the Kybalion is one of those niche, dusty occult books that only circulates in metaphysical bookshops and late-night internet forums. And sure, it's that too. But its ideas have quietly threaded themselves into places you wouldn't expect. Business seminars, wellness retreats, pop psychology bestsellers, even motivational TikToks. Here's the thing. You don't have to name the Kybalion to be using it. The 7 Hermetic Laws are like the background code running beneath a lot of modern thinking. And once you recognize the pattern, you start spotting it everywhere. Take the principle of mentalism, the all is mind. In the early 20th century, the New Thought movement ran with this idea, blending it with affirmations and visualization techniques that eventually morphed into what we now call mindset coaching. When you hear a billionaire on a podcast say it's all about how you think, they're unknowingly echoing a line that could have been lifted straight from page 1 of the Kybalion. The principle of correspondence, as above so below, pops up in everything from ecology, what we do to the earth we do to ourselves, to holistic medicine, treat the root cause, not just the symptom. Even NASA scientists talk about patterns repeating at different scales, the same spirals in seashells and galaxies. They might not call it Hermeticism, but the resonance is unmistakable. Vibration has been rebranded for the wellness crowd as raising your frequency. Quantum metaphors abound, some grounded, some pure fluff, but the underlying attraction is the same, the sense that life is energy in motion, and that you can tune yourself like an instrument. Every time you hear about high vibes only, you're hearing a diluted descendant of the Kybalion's third law. Polarity has become the backbone of modern shadow work and integration therapy. Psychologists talk about cognitive reframing, how an obstacle is just an opportunity viewed from a different mental angle. Relationship coaches preach that tension between opposites is not just normal, it's necessary. That's straight Hermetic thinking. Rhythm sneaks into productivity advice. Work with your natural cycles. Fitness influencers preach about rest days being as crucial as workout days. Even market analysts speak of economic cycles as though they were tides. Ancient Hermetic law repackaged for the day trader. Cause and effect is now the darling of personal accountability culture. You are the sum of your decisions. Could be a tagline for half the self-help section in any bookstore. Neuroscientists talk about neuroplasticity, your brain rewiring itself in response to repeated thoughts and actions. Hermeticists would just nod and say, yes, that's the law. Gender has shown up in the corporate world as balancing strategy and creativity, or combining analytical and intuitive thinking. It's not about male versus female. It's about blending the archetypal qualities. The best problem solvers switch between both modes naturally. And here's the kicker. Many of these modern applications are stripped of the mystical trappings, which is partly why they spread so far. The Kybalion's laws are simple enough to survive translation into almost any cultural language. Of course, this dilution has a cost. When you take Hermetic principles out of their original context, you risk losing the depth, the sense that these aren't just clever mental hacks, but patterns woven into the fabric of reality. A lot of modern law of attraction talk flattens the Kybalion into something like a cosmic vending machine. Think positive, get stuff. The original teaching was far richer and far less materialistic. Still, there's an argument to be made that this diffusion is exactly how Hermetic knowledge has always moved, quietly, under different names, wearing different masks. If the 7 laws are truly universal, then they'll keep showing up whether anyone credits the source or not. And maybe that's the Kybalion's greatest trick. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't need you to join a school or memorize a creed. Once the principles are in your mind, they start working on their own. You might close the book and forget the chapter titles, but you'll catch yourself thinking in correspondences, noticing rhythms, reframing polarities. The seed has been planted. That's why this little anonymous book from 1908 has outlived countless louder, flashier works. It was never meant to be a loud revolution. It's more like a whisper you can't unhear. Now, over a century later, it sits at the intersection of history and the present, a bridge between dusty Hermetic scrolls and the self-improvement podcasts in your earbuds. Whether you treat it as sacred philosophy or as a collection of useful mental models, the Kybalion has already done its job if it's changed the way you see. And with that, we close the main story. But as with any Hermetic teaching, endings are really just points in a cycle. We'll ease now into the conclusion, a slower descent, where history fades into reflection and the night closes in around the last lingering questions. There's a moment when you've been sitting with the Kybalion long enough that you stop thinking of it as a book. It becomes more like a background hum, the quiet rhythm under all things. And the more you notice it, the less you feel the need to do anything about it. You simply let it be there. The 7 laws stop feeling like rules written down by some ancient philosopher and start feeling like the way water just is wet or fire just is hot. They are not inventions. They are descriptions of something you've been living inside this whole time. At night, when the city quiets or the countryside deepens into stillness, you can almost hear them moving. Rhythm in the way the wind sways branches, vibration in the chorus of distant insects, polarity in the warmth of your blanket against the cool of the air, correspondence in the way your breathing mirrors the rise and fall of the dark around you. It's easy to think of Hermetic wisdom as something lofty, a mountaintop truth, a candlelit mystery only whispered in temples. But if the Kybalion teaches anything, it's that the highest truths are also the most ordinary. You don't have to sit cross-legged on a marble floor to see them. You could be brushing your teeth, taking the last sip of tea, watching your dog sleep, and still the laws are there. Mentalism isn't just about grand visions, it's also in the way you decide how to frame your day before you step out the door. Cause and effect isn't only about great karmic reckonings, it's also in the fact that your plant will lean toward the window if you leave it there long enough. Gender isn't just a mystical archetype, it's in the balance between your effort and your rest, your drive and your surrender. These laws breathe whether you believe in them or not. They don't demand worship, they don't even care if you remember their names. Maybe that's why they've survived so long. Every empire that's ever risen and fallen, every shift of language, every change of fashion, still happened inside these patterns. You could burn every copy of the Kybalion, and nothing would change. The laws would still be moving. The moon would still pull the tide. Heat would still rise. Cycles would still turn. And yet, there's something to be said for naming them. For saying, I see you, to the forces you've always felt but never put into words. It doesn't give you control over them, but it makes you less of a stranger in your own world. It's like meeting a neighbor you've been passing in the hallway for years and finally learning their name. The Hermeticists like to say that the laws were keys, not to unlock the universe like some cosmic treasure chest, but to unlock your own perception. Once you see the patterns, life stops feeling random. You begin to understand the why beneath the what, and that understanding has a way of softening you, the same way knowing the seasons will change makes winter feel less endless. So tonight, as you drift from this story into whatever dream waits for you, maybe you'll notice the subtle pulse of these laws in your own life. Not in the loud events, not in the triumphs and disasters, but in the small, constant movements that make up most of existence. The cup cooling on the table, the breath filling and emptying your lungs, the light slowly surrendering to the dark. Somewhere the old Hermetic teachers might be smiling at this, not because you've memorized anything, not because you've joined some secret order, but because you've started to notice. The Kybalion isn't a destination, It's a lens, and when you've looked through it long enough, you stop thinking about the lens at all. You just see differently. So we leave it here, not as a closed book, but as a quiet invitation to let the laws move in you the way they always have, to stop wrestling the river and just let the current teach you where it's going. And when you wake tomorrow, they'll be there again, patient, unchanging, waiting for you to notice. Good night.